The dusty road stretched out like a scar across the Texas hill country, a ribbon of caliche and gravel that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was the kind of road that held secrets in its cracks, the kind of path where the heat waves rising from the ground distorted reality until you weren't sure if you were looking at a mesquite tree or a ghost from your past. But today, the dust wasn't under the tires of a tractor or a horse trailer. It was settling on the pristine, manicured asphalt of the Dominion Country Club in San Antonio, a place where the air smelled less like sagebrush and more like money and expensive cologne. George Strait stood by the entrance of the clubhouse, adjusting the brim of his resistal hat against the relentless glare of the midday sun. At 69, the lines around his eyes were etched deep, like the grooves on a well-worn vinyl record, each one telling a story of a mile traveled or a song sung. He had just spent 3 hours in a meeting that felt longer than a cross-country tour in a bus with no air conditioning. The executives from the label, men in Italian loafers who had probably never stepped in cow manure in their lives, wanted to discuss legacy box sets and digital rights. George had nodded, smiled his polite, crooked smile, and said as little as possible. He was a man who measured his words the way a carpenter measures lumber, measure twice, cut once. He didn't like waste, especially wasted breath. He walked away from the glass doors, the cool air conditioning fading instantly as the Texas heat wrapped around him like a heavy wool blanket. He wasn't heading for a limousine. He was heading for his sanctuary. Parked in the far corner of the VIP lot, away from the Porsches and the Mercedes convertibles, sat his black Ford F-450 King Ranch. It was a beast of a machine, polished to a mirror shine, but beneath the wax it was a workhorse, just like him. It was the one place in this city where he could breathe. As he approached the truck, his boots clicking rhythmically on the pavement, a subtle frown touched his lips. George was a man of details. You didn't survive decades in the music business or on a working ranch without noticing when something was out of place. A gate left unlatched, a guitar string tuned a fraction sharp, a shadow where light should be. The passenger side window was cracked open about 2 inches. He always left it sealed tight. Always. He stopped 10 feet away, his blue eyes narrowing. The parking lot was deserted, save for a valet attendant dozing on a stool 50 yards away. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas and the low rumble of traffic on the interstate miles away. George scanned the perimeter, his instincts shifting from country singer to protective father and husband. He moved closer, slower now, his hand instinctively brushing the pocket of his jeans. Through the gap in the window, resting on the rich saddle-brown leather of the passenger seat, was a package. It was crude, wrapped in brown butcher paper that looked like it had been salvaged from a grocery bag, sealed with yellowing masking tape that was peeling at the corners. It was about the size of a large shoebox, but the shape was irregular. It didn't belong in the King Ranch. It looked like trash. It looked like a threat. George reached the door and pulled the handle. It was locked. He keyed the fob, the locks engaging with a solid thud that echoed in the quiet lot. He opened the door, and a wave of superheated air rushed out, carrying the scent of leather and something else. Old paper. Must. He didn't touch it immediately. He leaned in, staring at the object. Attached to the top of the package with a rusted paperclip was a piece of white notebook paper torn from a spiral binding. The handwriting was jagged, aggressive, written in thick black marker. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The heat vanished, replaced by a cold chill that ran down George's spine. Norma, his Norma, the woman who had been his rock, his compass, the only constant in a life of chaotic fame. For 50 years, they had been a team. They had buried a child together. They had built an empire together. There were no secrets between them. That was the deal. That was the foundation. But looking at that note, a poisonous root of doubt began to curl in George's stomach. She knows what this is. The phrasing implied intimacy. It implied a shared history that he was excluded from. Was it a threat? A blackmail attempt? A relic from a past she had buried before they met? No, that was impossible. They had been high school sweethearts. They had eloped in Mexico. He knew every scar on her soul. Or so he thought. George looked around the parking lot one last time, his eyes hard. If someone was watching, they would see the king of country standing motionless, a statue of resolve. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him panic. He reached out and grabbed the package. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. As he lifted it, something inside shifted with a dull, wooden clunk. He tossed it onto the floorboard, climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The interior of the truck was a fortress, but now, with that brown paper parcel sitting by his feet, it felt compromised. He started the engine, the diesel motor roaring to life, a comforting masculine sound that usually settled his nerves. Not today. Today, the rumble felt like a countdown. He didn't drive home. He couldn't go to the ranch, not yet. He couldn't look Norma in the eye until he knew what was inside that box. He needed isolation. He needed the truth, raw and unfiltered, before he could decide how to protect her, or how to forgive her. He drove north, away from the city, away from the traffic. He guided the massive truck onto a farm-to-market road that wound up into the limestone hills. The radio was off. The silence inside the cab was deafening. His mind was a storm. He thought about the early days, the struggles, the nights in cheap motels where they counted pennies to buy formula for the baby. Had she done something then? Had she borrowed money from the wrong people? Had she made a promise she couldn't keep? The scenery blurred past, live oaks, barbed wire fences, cattle grazing in the scrub brush. George saw none of it. He only saw the jagged black letters on the note. She knows. He pulled over at a scenic overlook, a gravel patch on the edge of a cliff that offered a view of the valley below. It was empty. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. George killed the engine. The silence returned, heavier than before. He reached down and hauled the package onto his lap. His hands, usually steady enough to thread a needle or rope a calf, were trembling slightly. It wasn't fear for himself. It was the terrifying possibility that his image of his wife was about to be shattered. He pulled his pocket knife from his jeans, a case trapper with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. He flicked the blade open. The steel glinted in the afternoon sun. With surgical precision, he sliced through the masking tape. It gave way with a dry, tearing sound. He peeled back the brown paper. Underneath was a hard black case. It wasn't a standard box. It was an instrument case, but smaller than a guitar. A mandolin? No, it was the top half of a guitar case, sawed off? No, that didn't make sense. He ripped the rest of the paper away. It was a guitar case, but it was old, battered, covered in stickers that had long since faded to white rectangles. And it was broken. No, it was a parlor guitar case. Small body. George's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the stickers. A faded Texas flag. A bumper sticker from a honky-tonk in San Marcos that burned down in 1980. He undid the latches. Snap, snap, snap. The sound was like gunshots in the quiet truck. He lifted the lid. The smell hit him first. Cedar, old rosewood, and the metallic tang of ancient strings. Resting in the blue velvet lining, which was crushed and matted with age, was a guitar. But not just any guitar. It was a 1974 Gibson Dove. His Gibson Dove. George stared, his mouth slightly open, the air rushing out of his lungs. He reached out, his calloused fingers hovering over the pickguard, which was engraved with the iconic mother-of-pearl dove. There was the scratch near the bridge, the one he had made with his belt buckle during a rowdy set at a dive bar in Lubbock. There was the burn mark on the headstock from a cigarette he had left wedged in the strings too long. This was the guitar, the one that had been stolen. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. 1981. They were on the road, barely making ends meet. The Ace in the Hole band was playing for door money. They had parked the van behind a motel in Austin. The lock had been busted. When they came out the next morning, the gear was gone. Amps, mic stands, and this guitar. He remembered the devastation. That guitar was his voice. It was the first quality instrument he had ever owned, bought with money he had saved from working construction. Losing it felt like losing a limb. He remembered sitting on the curb, head in his hands, ready to quit. He remembered telling Norma that maybe this was a sign, maybe he should just go back to the ranch and forget about music. And he remembered Norma. He remembered her face, pale and determined. She had held him. She had told him not to give up. 2 days later, she had come home with a cheap Yamaha and a wad of cash she said she got from selling her grandmother's silver tea set. She told him to keep playing. She told him the music mattered more than the wood. So why was the Gibson here? Why was it in his truck 40 years later, with a note saying Norma knew? Confusion warred with relief. It hadn't been destroyed, but the implication was darker. If Norma knew what this was, did she know where it had been? George lifted the guitar gently from the case. It felt familiar in his hands, like shaking hands with an old friend. As he lifted it, a thick manila envelope slid out from beneath the body of the guitar and landed on his lap. He set the guitar aside, leaning it against the steering wheel. He picked up the envelope. It was unsealed. He reached inside and pulled out the contents. The first thing he saw was a stack of small rectangular slips of paper, pawn tickets. They were pink and yellow, the carbon paper fading. He brought one close to his eyes, squinting in the dimming light. Capital City Pawn and Loan, Austin, Texas. Date October 14th, 1981. Item Gibson Dove acoustic guitar. Serial Jet A492. Pledgor Norma Strait. George felt the blood drain from his face. The world went silent. She hadn't sold her grandmother's silver. She hadn't found money from a miracle. She had pawned his guitar, the guitar he thought was stolen, the guitar he had grieved for. She had walked into a pawn shop, handed over his most prized possession, and taken the cash. Why? Anger flared, hot and sudden. She had lied. For 40 years, every time he told the story of the stolen Gibson in an interview, every time he lamented the thieves who took it, she had sat there and listened. She had nodded. She had let him believe a lie. It felt like a betrayal of the highest order. How could she look him in the eye? His hands shook as he shuffled through the papers. There were dozens of tickets, renewal slips, interest payments. November 1981, paid. December 1981, paid. January 1982, paid. She hadn't just sold it. She had pawned it, intending to get it back. She had been paying the interest. Beneath the pawn tickets was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was one of the diaries she used to keep. He recognized the cover. He flipped it open. The pages were brittle. He found the entry for October 1981. The handwriting was elegant, looping script, so different from the jagged marker on the box. October 12th, 1981. George is breaking. I can see it in his eyes. The van needs a transmission. The boys in the band need to eat. We have $40 left. If I tell him we're broke, he'll quit. He'll go back to the cattle pen because he thinks it's the responsible thing to do for me and Bubba. He's too proud to ask my dad for money. He's too proud to take a loan. He needs a miracle. But miracles cost money. I took the Gibson while he was sleeping. I told him I heard a noise outside, made it look like a break-in. I took it to the pawn shop on 6th Street. Mr. Henderson gave me $800. It's enough to fix the van and pay the band for the next 2 weeks. I bought a used Yamaha for $100 so he has something to play. It killed me to see him cry when he thought it was stolen. I felt like Judas, but if he knew I sold it, he would never play it again. He would feel the weight of the debt every time he strummed a chord. He needs to believe he's fighting bad luck, not poverty. I will get it back. I swear I will get it back, even if it takes me 10 years of hiding grocery money. George stopped reading. A lump, hard and painful, formed in his throat. The anger that had flared moments ago was extinguished, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it made his chest ache. She hadn't betrayed him. She had saved him. She had carried the burden of their poverty alone, so that he could carry the dream. She knew his pride, his stubborn cowboy pride, would have forced him to give up music to provide for his family if he knew how dire their situation really was. By staging the theft, she gave him a villain to fight instead of a reality to surrender to. He looked at the dates on the pawn tickets again. They stopped in 1986. He dug deeper into the envelope. There was a letter at the bottom. It wasn't in Norma's handwriting. It was written on the letterhead of Henderson Antiques and Pawn. The date was from yesterday. Dear Mr. Strait, my name is David Henderson. My father, Silas Henderson, owned the shop in Austin where your wife did business in the 80s. My father passed away last week. While cleaning out his personal safe, not the store inventory, but his private vault, I found this guitar and a letter addressed to me. My father wrote that in 1986, your wife came in with the full amount to reclaim the guitar. By then you had your first #1 hit. She wanted to surprise you. But my father, he was a complicated man. He realized who you were becoming. He lied to her. He told her the guitar had been sold to a collector in Japan because she missed a payment date by 1 day. He said it was gone. She cried in the store. She offered him double. He refused. He kept the guitar because he wanted to own a piece of the king. He kept it in his vault for 35 years, letting you and your wife believe it was lost forever. In his will, he expressed regret. He said the guilt ate at him every time he heard you on the radio. He instructed me to return this to you immediately upon his death, with no charge. He said, "Give it to Norma. She paid for it in tears." I am deeply sorry for my father's actions. I left this in your truck because I was too ashamed to face you. I hope this returns a piece of your history. Sincerely, David Henderson. George lowered the letter. The silence of the Texas evening was absolute. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple. He looked at the guitar. It wasn't just wood and wire, it was a monument to a young woman's terrifying gamble. Norma had lied to him, yes, but she had also been lied to. She had lived for 35 years thinking she had failed to retrieve his prize, thinking she had lost it forever because of a missed payment. Carrying that guilt silently while standing beside him on red carpets and in stadiums. He touched the strings. They were dead and rusted. "Oh, Norma," he whispered, his voice cracking in the empty cab. "You foolish, wonderful woman." He felt a sudden desperate need to see the man who wrote this letter. Not the father. The father was beyond judgment now. But the son. The boy who had the courage to sneak into a country club and return a fortune in memorabilia simply because it was the right thing to do. The note said he was ashamed. George knew something about shame, and he knew something about redemption. He checked the address on the letterhead. It was a small shop on the outskirts of San Antonio, near the old military base. George started the truck. The engine roared, but this time it sounded like a battle cry. He wasn't going home yet. He had one stop to make. He had to close the circle. He had to look this David Henderson in the eye. He put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the road, the tires kicking up dust that swirled in the red taillights. The king of country was on a mission. He had his guitar back, but more importantly, he had a new understanding of the woman waiting for him at the ranch. She wasn't just his wife, she was his savior. And she had no idea that the ghost she had been running from for 40 years was sitting in the passenger seat, riding shotgun. The road ahead was dark, but the headlights cut through it, bright and unwavering. George drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the guitar case, feeling the vibration of the road through the old wood. The tires of the F-450 hummed against the asphalt, a low baritone drone that usually served as a lullaby for George's racing thoughts. Tonight, however, the sound was a drum roll leading him into battle. The sun had completely vanished now, surrendering the Texas sky to a bruised twilight of deep indigo and charcoal. The headlights cut a sharp white path through the darkness, illuminating the scrub brush and the occasional eyes of a deer watching from the fence line. George didn't turn on the radio. He couldn't bear to hear music right now, not when the instrument sitting in the passenger seat, the wooden soul of his early career, was vibrating with the ghosts of 1981. His mind drifted back, pulled by the gravity of the diary he had just read. The memory was no longer a hazy recollection. It was sharp, high definition, and painful. He was 30 years old again. He was standing in the parking lot of that Motel 6 in Austin, the morning air thick with humidity and the smell of exhaust. He remembered the hollow feeling in his gut when he saw the back doors of the van pried open. He remembered falling to his knees on the oil-stained concrete. "It's gone, Norma," he had choked out, tears of pure frustration stinging his eyes. "The dove is gone, that's it, that's the sign. God's telling me to go back to Pearsall and raise cows." And he remembered her face. She was wearing that faded yellow sundress, holding their son's hand. She looked pale. He had thought it was shock. Now he knew it was terror. She was terrified not of the theft, but of his reaction. She was terrified that her gamble, pawning his heart to feed his dream, would backfire. "You are not quitting George Harvey Strait," she had said, her voice trembling but fierce. "It's just wood. The music isn't in the box, it's in you." She had looked him in the eye and lied. She had lied with the conviction of a saint protecting a sinner. She had absorbed his grief, let him rage against invisible thieves, all while knowing exactly where that guitar hung, behind a metal cage in a pawn shop on 6th Street, accruing interest she didn't have the money to pay. George gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "You carried that," he whispered to the empty cab. "You let me be the victim, so I wouldn't have to be the failure." The GPS on the dashboard chirped, signaling his exit. He was leaving the hill country, descending into the outskirts of San Antonio, where the zoning laws were loose and the streetlights flickered. This wasn't the part of town where country legends lived. This was the part of town where people went when they ran out of options. He turned onto a street lined with auto body shops, payday loan centers, and shuttered storefronts. At the end of the block, a solitary neon sign buzzed with a dying electrical hum: Henderson Antiques and Pawn. The P was burnt out, leaving it to read AWN. The shop looked like a fortress built of junk. The windows were barred with heavy iron grates. Through the dusty glass, George could see the silhouettes of clutter, stacks of VCRs, rows of tools, bicycles hanging from the ceiling like bats. George parked the truck right in front. He didn't care if it was a tow zone. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, breathing in the stale air of the cab. He needed to be calm. He needed to be George Strait, the man who never cracked, not George Strait, the husband whose heart was breaking. He grabbed the Gibson case. He wasn't leaving it in the truck, not ever again. He stepped out. The heat of the day still radiated from the sidewalk. He walked to the door and tried the handle. Locked. He looked at his watch. 8:15 p.m. They closed at 6. He knocked. A solid, authoritative rap on the glass. Silence. He knocked again, harder this time. The glass rattled in its frame. "We're closed," a muffled voice shouted from the back. "Come back tomorrow." George didn't yell, he didn't plead. He just leaned close to the gap between the doors and spoke in that deep, resonant drawl that had sold millions of records. "This is George Strait. Open the door, son." They pause. A long, heavy silence stretched out, broken only by the distant siren of a police car. Then the sound of a chair scraping against concrete. Footsteps, hesitant and shuffling, approached the door. A shadow blocked the light. Locks tumbled. 1, 2, 3 deadbolts disengaging with heavy metallic clanks. The door creaked open. Standing there was a young man, maybe 30. He looked nothing like the sort of person who would rob a celebrity. He wore a faded flannel shirt, glasses that kept sliding down his nose, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His eyes went from George's face to the guitar case in his hand, and all the color drained from his cheeks. "Mr. Strait," the young man stammered. He took a step back, almost tripping over a stack of old vinyl records. I didn't think you'd come here. I thought you'd send the police." George stepped inside. The shop smelled of lemon oil, dust, and old paper, the smell of time standing still. He kicked the door shut behind him with his heel. "I don't need the police to handle my family's business," George said quietly. He walked past the counter, past the glass display cases filled with turquoise jewelry and knives, and set the guitar case down on a clear patch of the counter. He turned to face the young man. "You David?" "Yes, sir. David Henderson." The young man was wringing his hands, looking everywhere but at George's piercing blue eyes. "David," George said, his voice level but heavy with an undercurrent of steel. "You left a package in my truck. You bypassed security at the Dominion. You touched my wife's name." "I didn't mean any disrespect, sir," David blurted out, sweat beading on his forehead. "I swear, I couldn't mail it. I couldn't risk it getting lost again, and I couldn't walk up to your front gate. They would have arrested me. I saw your truck schedule. I mean, I knew you played golf on Thursdays, everyone knows. I just wanted to get it back to you." George studied him. The boy was terrified, yes, but there was something else in his eyes. A desperate need for absolution. "Your letter," George said, leaning against the counter, crossing his arms. You said your father lied to my wife. David flinched. He walked behind the counter and pulled out a stool, collapsing onto it as if his legs could no longer hold him. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. My dad, Silas Henderson. He was a hard man, Mr. Strait. He built this business on other people's bad luck. That's what pawnbroking is mostly. But he had a code, usually. David looked up, his eyes wet. But when your wife came in back in '81, he said there was something about her. She was desperate, but she was dignified. She made him promise not to sell it. She paid the interest every single month. Sometimes she came in with quarters and dimes rolled up in paper. George felt a sharp pang in his chest. Quarters and dimes. While he was out playing honky-tonks, drinking beer on the house, feeling sorry for himself about his stolen gear, Norma was rolling coins to keep his history alive. So what happened? George asked, his voice rasping. 1986, David continued. You were huge by then. Does Fort Worth ever cross your mind was on every radio. My dad realized what he had in the safe. It wasn't just a used Gibson anymore. It was George Strait's first Gibson. The value had skyrocketed. David took a breath, shaking his head in disgust. Your wife came in. She was happy. She was wearing a nice dress. She had a check. She said, I'm here to take George's guitar home. I'm going to give it to him for his birthday. And my dad... He looked her in the eye and told her he sold it 3 days ago because she was late on a payment. George's jaw tightened. Was she late? No, David whispered. She was 2 days early. He lied. He wanted to keep it. He thought it would be the crown jewel of his collection. He told her it went to a collector in Tokyo and it was gone forever. George closed his eyes. He could picture it. Norma standing in this very room or one just like it, her joy turning to ash. The guilt she must have felt. She had finally saved enough to redeem the secret, only to be told she had failed. And she had never told him. She had swallowed that pain to spare him the anger. She had let him go on believing the lie about the theft because the truth, that she had pawned it and lost it, would have hurt him more. She cried, David said softly. My dad wrote it in his journal. He said she didn't scream, she just stood there and cried silently. She asked if he could get it back. He said no. She left, and she never came back. The silence in the shop was thick enough to choke on. George looked around at the shelves of discarded items, wedding rings, tools, cameras. How many other stories of heartbreak were trapped in this room? My dad died last week, David said, his voice breaking. Pancreatic cancer, it was fast. Before he went, he gave me the combination to his private floor safe. He told me, David, I've got a lot of sins to answer for, but there's one I can't take to the grave. He made me promise. He said, give it back to Norma, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her she was the only one who ever beat me, because she never stopped loving him. David stood up and walked over to a drawer. He pulled out a checkbook. My dad left me some money. Not much, but enough. I want to offer you. He started writing. I know I can't pay for the distress, but... George reached out and placed his hand over the pen, stopping it. His hand was large, rough, and warm. Put the pen away, son, George said gently. David looked up, confused. But the theft, the fraud... Your daddy did the fraud, George said. Not you. You're the one who drove to the Dominion and risked getting tackled by security to bring a piece of wood back to a man you don't know. George picked up the guitar case from the counter. He held it like a weapon, but his face had softened. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, weary clarity. You know what this is, David? George asked, tapping the lid of the case. It's $1 million guitar, sir. No, George shook his head. It's a mirror. Your daddy looked in it and saw greed. You looked in it and saw a chance to do the right thing. And my wife... George's voice caught, just for a second. My wife looked in it and saw a future for me that I couldn't see for myself. George adjusted his hat. He looked at the young man, really looked at him. He saw the poverty of the shop, the struggle to keep the lights on. You keeping this place open? George asked. I'm trying, sir. But with the debts my dad left, I probably have to sell the inventory and close up by Christmas. George reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He didn't carry cash like a normal person. He pulled out a card, a business card, plain white with black text. George Strait Enterprises. He scribbled a number on the back, a private number. You call this number tomorrow morning. Ask for Irv. Tell him George said to book you for an appraisal job. Appraisal? David blinked. I have a warehouse full of gear. 40 years of touring, road cases, old amps, stuff I haven't looked at since the Reagan administration. I need someone honest to catalogue it, someone who knows the difference between trash and treasure, someone who won't steal from me. George placed the card on the counter. You seem to be the only honest man I've met all day. David stared at the card, his mouth agape. Mr. Strait, Thank you. Don't thank me, George said, turning toward the door. You gave me back something money can't buy. You gave me the truth. George walked to the door, the guitar case heavy in his hand. He paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at the dusty, dim shop. One more thing, David. Yes, sir? If you ever find a diary or a letter belonging to a lady, you don't read it. You just return it. A woman's heart is a private place. Yes, sir. I understand. George stepped out into the night. The air had cooled slightly, but the heat of the encounter still flushed his skin. He walked back to the truck, placed the guitar gently in the passenger seat again, and climbed in. As he drove away from the neon buzz of the pawn shop, the city lights of San Antonio spread out before him like a sea of diamonds. But his destination wasn't the city. It was the ranch. It was home. The drive back was different. The dread was gone. In its place was an overwhelming, crushing sense of gratitude. He thought about Norma waiting for him. She was probably sitting on the back porch, watching the stars, wondering why he was late. She had no idea that the weight she had been carrying for 4 decades was about to be lifted. He thought about the lyrics of songs he had sung 1,000 times, songs about love, about sacrifice. He realized he hadn't understood them. Not really. He had sung them, but Norma had lived them. He turned off the highway and onto the private road that led to their ranch. The tires crunched on gravel, the sound of home. The gate opened automatically. He drove up the winding driveway, past the horse barns, past the arena where he roped with his son. The house was glowing warm and yellow in the distance. It was a beacon. George parked the truck near the garage. He turned off the engine. The silence of the ranch wrapped around him, broken only by the whinny of a horse in the distance. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of sage and dust. He grabbed the guitar case. He grabbed the envelope with the pawn tickets and the diary. He walked toward the house. His boots felt heavy, but his heart felt light. He wasn't the king of country right now. He was just a husband who had a debt to pay, a debt of love. He opened the back door and stepped into the kitchen. It was quiet. A single light was on over the stove. "Norma," he called out softly. "In the den, George." Her voice came back, familiar and comforting. "Did the meeting go long? I saved you some pot roast." George walked through the hallway. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He stopped at the doorway of the den. Norma was sitting in her favorite armchair, reading a book. She wore reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked up as he entered, a smile forming on her face, that smile that had anchored him for 50 years. "You look tired, honey," she said, closing her book. "Do you want a glass of tea?" Then she saw it. She saw the black case in his hand, the battered, sticker-covered case she hadn't seen since 1981, the case she had handed over to a man with greedy eyes to save her family. The color drained from her face so fast it was frightening. Her hand flew to her mouth. The book slid from her lap and hit the floor with a thud. "George," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Where did you get that?" George didn't speak immediately. He walked into the room and set the case down on the coffee table. He placed the envelope next to it. He looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He didn't see a liar. He didn't see a deceiver. He saw a warrior. "I took a detour," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "I met a young man named David Henderson." Norma let out a small, strangled sob. She stood up, trembling, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were cold. "George, I can explain. I didn't steal it. I mean, I did. But—" "Hush," George said gently. He stepped over the distance between them. He ignored his aching knees and went down. He knelt on one knee in front of her, just like he had when he proposed in a dusty field half a century ago. He took her hands. They were cold. He warmed them in his. "I read the diary, Norma," he said. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out. I'm so sorry I lied to you. I just couldn't let you give up. We had nothing, George. And I knew if you knew we were broke, you'd sell your saddle and your soul to fix it. I had to buy us time." "You didn't buy time," George said, looking up at her with fierce adoration. "You bought me a life." He reached over and unlatched the case. He flipped the lid open. The Gibson dove lay there, gleaming under the lamplight, the mother-of-pearl bird catching the glow. "It wasn't stolen," George said, his voice breaking. "It was invested. You invested in me when I wasn't worth a dime." Norma looked at the guitar. She reached out a shaking hand and touched the neck. "He told me he sold it," she wept. "That man, he told me it was gone forever. I thought I had lost your heart." "You never lost it," George said. "It was right here. It was always right here." He stood up and pulled her into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing, 40 years of secret guilt finally pouring out. George held her tight, resting his chin on her head, rocking her slowly. "I was so afraid," she muffled into his shirt. "I was afraid you'd hate me for the lie." "Hate you?" George pulled back to look at her. He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Norma, I have never loved you more than I do right now. You are the only reason anyone knows my name. You are the music. I'm just the singer." He let go of her and picked up the guitar. He sat down on the coffee table, the instrument feeling strange and yet perfect in his lap. The strings were dead, but the wood was alive. He strummed a G chord. It was out of tune, flat and discordant, but to George it sounded like a symphony. "Do you remember the first song I wrote on this?" he asked. Norma sniffled, wiping her eyes. A small smile touched her lips. "I remember. You wrote it in the bathroom because the acoustics were better." George began to tune the guitar. Twang, hum, twang. He adjusted the pegs with muscle memory that hadn't faded. "I'm going to play it," he said. "For you. Just for you." The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The ranch outside was asleep, but inside, a new chapter was beginning. The secrets were gone. The stolen guitar was home. And the king of country was just a man singing to the woman who had saved him. He cleared his throat, looked at his wife, and began to play. It wasn't a stadium anthem. It was a simple melody, raw and honest. And as he sang, the years melted away, leaving only the truth. But the story wasn't quite over. As the last note faded, Norma looked at the envelope on the table. She saw the pawn tickets, and then she saw something sticking out of the back of the diary that George hadn't noticed. "George," she said, reaching for the book. "What's this?" George stopped playing. "What?" She pulled out a folded piece of paper from the back pocket of the leather journal. It wasn't old. It was new. It had been tucked in there recently, likely by David Henderson, hidden where only a woman would look. She unfolded it. Her eyes widened. "It's a receipt," she said, confused. "For what?" "For the pawn shop," she read. "It says, 'Paid in full, balance 0, account closed.'" But then she looked at the bottom. There was a handwritten note from David. "Mrs. Strait, my father kept one other thing in the safe. He said you left it on the counter the day you tried to buy the guitar back in your grief. You ran out so fast you forgot it." Norma reached into the envelope again, her fingers brushing against something small and cold at the very bottom, something George had missed because he was focused on the papers. She pulled it out. It was a silver locket. Norma gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "My mother's locket. I thought I lost it in the parking lot that day." She opened it. Inside was a tiny black and white photo of George and Norma at their wedding, barely 20 years old, looking scared and invincible. George stood up and looked at the locket. He looked at the guitar. He looked at his wife. "Everything finds its way home eventually," George said softly. He took the locket and fastened it around her neck. It rested there against her skin, a piece of the past reclaimed. "Play it again, George," Norma whispered. touching the locket. "Play it loud enough for the angels to hear." And he did. The sun rose over the South Texas brush country with a quiet majesty, painting the sky in streaks of apricot and violet. It was the kind of morning that usually found George Strait in the saddle, checking fence lines or watching the cattle graze in the cool air before the heat set in. But today the king of country was not on a horse. He was in his kitchen, standing over a pot of coffee, watching the steam rise and swirl in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the window. On the heavy oak table behind him sat the Gibson dove. In the daylight its scars were more visible. The finish was checked and cracked like a dry riverbed. The pickguard was peeling slightly at the corner. It looked like a survivor. It looked like a veteran of a war nobody knew had been fought. Norma walked in, wrapped in a soft robe, her hair loose. She didn't say a word. She walked up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his back. They stood there for a long time, the silence between them no longer filled with the tension of secrets, but with the comfortable weight of shared truth. "You didn't sleep much," she said softly. "Couldn't," George replied, turning to face her. He held a mug of coffee out to her. "I was thinking about the warehouse, all that gear-gathering dust, all those memories packed away in crates. You're going to hire that boy, aren't you?" Norma took the coffee, her eyes searching his. "I called Irv at 6 this morning," George said. "I told him to clear the schedule for the morning. I told him we have a new archivist coming in to handle the legacy collection. David Henderson starts today." Norma smiled, and it was a smile that reached her eyes, clearing away the last shadows of the previous night's tears. "You're a good man, George Strait." "No," George shook his head, looking past her at the guitar on the table. "I'm a lucky man. A good man wouldn't have needed his wife to sell her heritage to keep him afloat. I've got a lot of making up to do, Norma, starting tonight." "Tonight?" "The gala at the AT&T Center," George said. "The fundraiser for the veterans. I was going to play the usual set, but I'm changing the lineup." Later that morning, the industrial district of San Antonio was waking up to the grind of delivery trucks and machinery. David Henderson stood outside the massive, unmarked metal gate of a warehouse complex that looked more like a military compound than a musician's storage facility. He was wearing his best shirt, pressed but frayed at the collar, and he was sweating despite the morning chill. He held the business card George had given him like a talisman. A black SUV pulled up. The window rolled down, revealing Irv Woolsey, George's longtime manager, a man who had seen everything in the music business twice. Irv looked the boy up and down, chewing on an unlit cigar. "You, David?" Irv asked, his voice gravelly. "Yes, sir." "Hop in. Boss is waiting." They drove through the gates, past rows of tour buses and semi-trucks emblazoned with the Strait logo. They stopped in front of a hangar-sized building. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of cedar and electronics. It was a cathedral of country music history. Rows of flight cases stacked to the ceiling, racks of sequined jackets from the 80s, shelves of awards that hadn't found a place on the mantel. George was standing by a workbench inspecting an old Fender amp. He looked up as David approached. The young man looked like he was walking to the gallows, terrified that this was all a cruel joke or a trap. "Morning, son," George said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Mr. Strait," David swallowed hard. I didn't know if you were serious." "I don't joke about business," George said. He gestured to the expanse of the warehouse. "This is 40 years of my life. It's a mess. I need everything catalogued. Serial numbers, condition reports, provenance. I need to know what I have so I can auction some of it off for charity. You know guitars?" "I grew up in a pawn shop, sir. I can appraise anything from a pre-war Martin to a 50s Telecaster." "Good," George nodded. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded check. He handed it to David. David unfolded it. His knees buckled. He had to grab the workbench to steady himself. The amount was staggering. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to pay off the liens on his father's shop. Enough to bury his father with dignity. Enough to start over. This is an advance?" David whispered. "That's a retainer," George corrected. "For the first 6 months. I expect hard work, I expect honesty, and I expect you to keep your mouth shut about what you see in here. Can you do that?" David looked up, tears streaming down his face behind his glasses. He nodded vigorously, unable to speak. One more thing, George said, his voice dropping lower. That shop of yours, the pawn shop. I'm going to close it, sir. Pay the debts and walk away. Don't, George said. Clean it up. Take the bars off the windows. Turn it into a vintage instrument store. You have an eye for the good stuff. Stop profiting off misery and start selling music. You do that, and I'll be your first customer. David wiped his face with his sleeve. I won't let you down, Mr. Strait. I know you won't, George said. Now get to work. Irv will show you the system. George turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. He didn't look back. He had balanced the scales. The son would not pay for the sins of the father. The AT&T Center was a cauldron of noise. 18,000 people packed the arena. A sea of cowboy hats and boots, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and anticipation. It was a hometown show, and the energy was electric. Backstage in the dressing room, the atmosphere was different. Usually it was a place of relaxed focus. The ace in the whole band sat around, tuning instruments, cracking jokes. But tonight, there was a hushed reverence. On the stand in the middle of the room sat the Gibson Dove. George stood in front of a mirror, buttoning his cuffs. He looked at his reflection. He saw the gray in his beard, the lines on his face. He didn't see the young man who had cried in a motel parking lot in 1981. He saw the man that young boy had become, thanks to a woman who refused to let him fail. Norma sat on the sofa in the corner. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress, and around her neck, the silver locket caught the light. She looked nervous. Are you sure about this, George? She asked. It hasn't been played on stage in 4 decades. It might not hold the tune. It'll hold, George said, turning to her. It's got a lot of heart in it. That's what holds the tune. He walked over and picked up the guitar. He didn't plug it in. There were no pickups. He walked over to the sound technician. Mike, George said, I need a mic stand center stage. Low, for an acoustic, no cable. Are you going unplugged, boss? Mike asked, surprised. In an arena this size? Just for one song, George said. The house lights went down. The roar of the crowd was like a physical wave shaking the walls. The announcer's voice boomed over the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, the king of country, George Strait. The spotlight hit the stage. George walked out. He didn't run. He strolled, waving his hat to the crowd, soaking in the love that washed over him. But when he reached the microphone, he didn't strap on his usual black guitar. He reached back, and a stagehand handed him the battered, sticker-covered Gibson Dove. A murmur went through the front rows. The die-hard fans, the ones who knew every piece of trivia, squinted at the screens. They saw the faded stickers. They saw the wear. They whispered to each other, "Is that the lost guitar?" George adjusted the microphone stand. The arena went quiet, sensing that this wasn't part of the script. "Thank you," George said, his voice booming through the speakers. "It's good to be home in San Antonio." The crowd erupted again, then settled. "Do you know," George continued, strumming a G chord that rang out with a warm, woody resonance, "folks ask me all the time about the secret to success. They ask about the songs, the miles, the records. They want to know how you keep going for 40 years. He looked down at the guitar, running his hand along the neck. "I used to tell them it was luck or maybe just stubbornness, but I was wrong." He looked up, scanning the dark ocean of faces until his eyes found the spot in the wings where Norma was standing, watching him from the shadows. "The secret isn't the singer," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "The secret is the person standing beside him when the lights are off. The one who believes when the bank account is empty. The one who carries the heavy end of the load so you can walk tall." He paused. The silence in the arena was absolute. 18,000 people held their breath. "I lost this guitar in 1981, George said, or I thought I did. I thought it was stolen by thieves. I spent 40 years mourning it, but I found out yesterday that it wasn't stolen, it was sacrificed. It was traded by my wife, Norma, to keep food on our table and gas in our van, so I wouldn't have to give up on this dream." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "She carried that secret for 40 years, George said, his voice cracking slightly. "She let me believe a lie because she knew my pride couldn't handle the truth. She saved me from myself, and she got it back. It took a lifetime, but she got it back." George stepped closer to the mic. "Norma," he said, and his voice was intimate, as if they were the only two people in the room. "I know you're back there. I know you hate the spotlight, but tonight, this song, and every song I've ever sung, belongs to you. You are the music, honey. I'm just the amplifier." He looked at the band and nodded. They stayed silent. No drums, no fiddle. Just George and the dove. He began to play. It was Amarillo by Morning, but it wasn't the polished radio-ready version. It was raw. The strings buzzed slightly against the frets. The wood groaned, but the sound was pure. It was the sound of 1981, filtered through the wisdom of 2023. Amarillo by Morning, up from San Antone. His voice soared, clearer and stronger than it had been in years. He wasn't singing for the crowd. He was singing for the girl in the yellow sundress who had walked into a pawn shop with tears in her eyes and sold her heart to save his. Backstage, Norma pressed her hand to the locket. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She stood tall. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of the secret. She felt the lightness of being seen. As George hit the final note, letting it ring out into the silence, he didn't bow. He turned to the side of the stage, took off his hat, and held it over his heart, looking directly at her. The crowd followed his gaze. They didn't see her, hidden in the wings, but they understood. The applause that followed wasn't a roar, it was a thunderclap of respect. It went on, a standing ovation that shook the foundations of the building. George walked off the stage, the guitar clutched in his hand. He walked past the high fives of the crew, past the manager, straight to Norma. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her into a hug that lifted her off her feet. "You did good, cowboy," she whispered in his ear. "We did good," he corrected her. Later that night, the bus was quiet as it rolled down the interstate, heading back toward the ranch. The show was over, the lights were off. George and Norma sat in the back lounge. The Gibson Dove was back in its case, resting on the seat opposite them. George looked out the window at the passing telephone poles, the rhythm of the road a comfort he had known his whole life. But the road felt different now. It wasn't a path away from home. It was a circle that had finally closed. "David called me after the show," George said quietly. "Oh?" Norma looked up from her book. "He found something else in the warehouse. An old recording reel from '82, a demo I made. He's digitizing it. He said he's going to frame the first dollar he makes from the new vintage shop and send it to us." Norma smiled. "He's going to be all right." "Yeah," George nodded. "We're all going to be all right." He reached across the small table and took her hand. His thumb traced the lines on her palm. The hands that had held babies, held the steering wheel of a beat-up van, held a pawn ticket, and held him together. "Norma," he said. "Yes, George?" "Don't ever sell the farm to save me again," he teased gently, a twinkle in his eye. She laughed, a soft musical sound. "I won't have to. You finally made it, George Strait." George looked at the guitar case one last time. It was just wood and wire, but it was also a bridge across time, across poverty, across pride. "I didn't make it," he said, leaning back and closing his eyes, his hand still holding hers tight. "We made it." The bus rolled on into the Texas night, carrying the king and his queen and the ghost of a guitar that had finally found its way home. The road was long, but for the first time in 40 years, the rearview mirror was clear.